Welcome to the program. It is an honor to be able to speak with you all again on this episode 14 of the Brian J. Matos Show. And we are, hard to believe, 14 episodes into this journey of discovery, into building this community of curious minds. And I thank you all for joining me. And I have heard you as you have reached out to me through email, through social media, through my website, through other channels, and given me feedback about what you like about the show and what you'd like to see done differently on this program. And it's been a great inspiration for me. And one of the requests, one of the most frequent requests, much to my surprise, has been that you all want to hear more from me in a one-to-one fashion. As much as you enjoy our interviews, you enjoyed those early episodes where I shared some of my thoughts on big think topics that I thought were worth sharing, things that I think about, and you want to hear more. And so this week's episode is devoted to that. As I previewed at the end of episode 13, I thought it was important that we spend a little more time together and responding to your requests. That's what we're going to do today. And I do have a topic lined up that I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about. And for those who are new to the program, first and foremost, let me remind you of where you can find our show and where you can listen to all of our past episodes. And I think you're going to enjoy those early episodes of me just introducing the topic of the show, and it'll make all the following episodes be a little more meaningful, hopefully, for you. But if you want to skip around, if you want to jump to a particular interview or a particular topic, I certainly encourage you to do so. So let me begin by reminding you all that we are available on every major podcast platform. You can find us on Apple Podcasts. You can find us on Spotify. You can find us on Odyssey, on iHeartRadio. Libsyn is our host website. We are on that website proper. We're also on their Android app. We're on their Apple and iPhone application. You can find us on Player FM. You can find us on Samsung Podcasts. You can find us on Audible if you're an Amazon Music listener. There's basically not a podcast platform out there that this show is not available for subscription. And we have made sure that we've covered as many bases as we possibly can. So if you have a podcast platform of choice, whatever it is, whether you're an Apple podcast listener, a Spotify listener, an iHeartRadio listener, you can find us. And if all else fails, you can always come to my website, brianjmatos.com. All of our episodes are posted there for free, no subscription necessary. You can listen to any one of our shows anytime you want, any place you want. Take the shows with you. And we also post clips of these on our YouTube channel. That's the Brian J. Matos Show YouTube channel. You can look for at Brian J. Matos Podcast if you're looking specifically for just landing on that page. But just go to youtube.com, type in Brian J. Matos or Brian J. Matos Podcast, and you will get to our homepage. You can also find me on your favorite social media channels. I am on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Brian J. Matos. You can find me on Facebook. I have a fan page there, the Brian J. Matos Podcast. If you want to find my personal page, it's brian.matos, and you can link off to my podcast page from there, and I encourage you to follow that page for the latest updates. I am available on Instagram. I'm at Brian J. Matos on that platform. And again, you can reach me by email anytime if you have questions, comments about the show, or you have a guest that you'd like to be booked on this program. I'm available at info at brianjmatos.com. So let me give you a quick reminder of the nature of this show and what we do and what we try to accomplish, and also to talk a little bit about the journey that we've been on so far. So if you go all the way back to the beginning of our experience here, I introduced this as a community of curious minds, which at its very best and at the core of what we are and what we do, we are very much a community of curious minds. And the goal of this show is not to talk about the news of the day. You have plenty of sources to do that. We're not here to debate big policy issues per se. We're not here to chase after the big story of the moment or even of the quarter. We are here to talk big picture. We're here to talk about the big trends that you need to know about if you are taking care of your community, taking care of your business, taking care of your family, for goodness sake. The bigger than big topics that don't get covered on the evening news, that don't get talked about on the morning drive time radio shows, that don't get the headlines in the daily newspaper, because these are not daily issues per se. These are big issues, the big topics that creep up on us. So, as an example, in my debut episode, as I previewed what we were going to talk about in the weeks and the months to come, one of the things that I thought it was very important that we focus on was sort of bigger than big topics, issues like the nature of the American presidency, for example, and how overwhelming that is. And so that topic is so much bigger than who's in the office today or who's going to be office in the future or who's running for that office. It's the nature of the office itself and what it means for all of us. Another topic that I covered was the idea of artificial intelligence. And is this something we should be concerned about? Is it something we should be celebrating? How should we think about it? And I rendered an initial thought about how I think we should look at the topic, but I wanted to introduce it to this audience because I knew we were going to have guests coming up that were actually experts in this and could give us a real deep insight as to the future of AI in our world and what it meant from a cybersecurity standpoint and what it meant from a everyday work perspective. And we still have more guests to come in the future that are going to help us walk through the practical potential as well as the risks associated with it. And then we had some great, great guests that joined our program. And I wish I could take a moment to talk through all of them, but I just encourage you to go back and subscribe to the program and listen to some of our recent guests as well as some of our older guests, whether Nick Denning, who joined us in episode 6, talking about combating modern cyber threats and some of the deep insights he was able to give us about that particular topic, or Glenn Somerville and some of the important lessons in leadership. Bradley Sherman, one of the most fascinating topics that we had. We went a little long in that interview talking about demographic changes. These are big, big, big topics. And that episode 8 is one I've gone back and listened to a few times because of how important these demographic shifts and changes are to every aspect of our life as individuals, communities, and countries and nation states. And I've been inspired by some of my guests. Episode 10 with Lisa Patel. What a magnificent conversation that we had on the cutting edge of drug research and what it could mean, what the potential in some of the work that she has been doing and her company has been doing, and how that may make a difference in the lives of so many people who have been suffering for so long, and they're just an innovation away, potentially, from being able to live better quality lives. That was followed up in episode 11 when I had Lucy Jung on the program, and another great entrepreneur who's motivated by a passion to help people. And in her case, people who have been suffering and struggling with Parkinson's disease and a medical device that may very well improve their lives. Episode 12, Josh Penner. It was a great time interviewing the mayor of a small town in Washington state, but also a U.S. military veteran and an inspired entrepreneur who wants to use AI and specifically has applications for that to serve the public good. And then our most recent episode, episode 13 with Richard Hollis, risk mitigation in cyberspace. I don't care if you're a small business owner or you're a CEO or the CTO or the CIO of a big Fortune 500 company or a multinational mega company. You need to understand what was said in that podcast. If you're leading a business, if you have any exposure to the internet, you need to understand what Richard was talking us through from somebody who's been there and done that and spent decades in the industry and knows that full security is not possible. It's about risk mitigation and how you do it. That's a very important topic. And we're going to come back to that topic in a moment. But the point is, Every one of these guests has come on to expand our knowledge of the world around us and to talk about the really big topics, the big issues around medical innovations, cybersecurity, big global demographic changes, talking about technology at a very granular and innovative level. What are those big think issues that are out there? And that's what this show is really meant to be. And I hope that when you listen to the show, it expands your mind. I hope it makes you more curious to learn about these people that we bring on and their expertise and their companies. And for those of you who are leading businesses or aspiring to lead businesses, for those of you who are small business owners yourselves, and for those who are just good public servants trying to learn as much as they can so that they can apply that knowledge to their craft and to their industry or to the communities that they serve. It is my humble duty to try and do the best I can to share with you all the things that I'm learning and all the things that I'm curious about. So, in that context, I'm really looking forward to next week's episode where we're going to have Carrie Ann Benton Stimson, who I think is a fascinating chief marketing officer for the JMMB group in Jamaica, but so much more than a CMO, has an important point of view to share on leadership, on the concept of internal marketing, and how companies can think about advocating for themselves with their employee base. But I think she also had some important insights for us about your own career development and how you can approach that wherever you are in the world. And I think it was very important on this show to continue a theme that we've had with so many of our guests. Even though we're based in the US and I live in the state of Texas, I think it's important to bring guests from around the world. And I've been so privileged to have guests from Australia, Carrie Ann from Jamaica. We've had guests from the UK, guests from Canada, to get a global perspective because I want this to be a global community. And it's only by getting global perspectives that we can build a global community. So I hope you'll tune in for that show next week. And the last thing I wanted to cover before I get into the topic of the week and address something that the audience has been asking me a little bit about, I also want to just thank you all. I have been pleasantly surprised at the reception on all of our channels, and in particular, I don't think I understood getting into the podcast space how intimate and how one-to-one of an experience this really is. Some of my formal training many years ago, when I thought I was going to spend a career in the traditional media space, I was trained on mass media, literally speaking to the masses, speaking to potentially millions of people at a time, or at least, tens of thousands of people if you're doing a small radio or television station. And the podcast medium is so different. The audience is smaller, but it's much more invested. And it is so much more of a one-to-one relationship. And I deeply, deeply appreciate that. And thank you all for helping build that community with me. I am certainly appreciative of all the messages that I get to receive truly from around the world that I otherwise wouldn't have access to. So you're making this special for me. I hope I make it special for you, and I hope you all connect with each other, and perhaps you can use my website or my social media channels as the forum to do that. All that having been said, I've also seen that there's a unique audience on YouTube, which I guess shouldn't be a surprise, but it is a separate and unique and distinct group that follows some of our video clips, and they leave some comments, and I get some engagement on that channel. So one thing we're going to be looking at in the weeks and months to come, since it is a different platform and the content sort of needs to be delivered a little differently to work on that channel, we're going to continue posting clips of these shows and preview clips, but I'd love to make some special content just for our YouTube friends, since it is a channel that is more of a short form and short video format. And since we have a unique group of folks who follow us on that platform that don't necessarily subscribe to our podcasts, I want to do something a little special just for that group. Short clips, things that we can just talk about in more of a one-to-one setting, but keeping with the theme of curious minds. So stay tuned for that. In the meantime, if you want to be the first to see what we do on that channel, let's go to youtube.com, visit the channel, subscribe to the Brian J. Matos podcast channel at Brian J. Matos. podcast, and you'll be the first to get those video clips, whether they're the preview clips or anything we do special and custom just for that channel. Okay, so let's talk about a topic that I do think is worth exploring for a moment because it's been on my mind, and in this environment of thinking big and thinking big picture, Richard Hollis gave me some stuff to think about last week with the idea of risk. And for anybody who is in the business community, but even if you're just taking care of your family, your community, your neighborhood, risk is an ever present part of our lives. It always has been, it always will be. There's all forms of risk that we have to mitigate. Last week's episode, the last episode of the program, was all about mitigating risk in cyberspace specifically. And Richard's thesis on that really was you can't eliminate the risk, it's impossible. You can only mitigate, and you have to make decisions about what trade offs you're willing to make and what risks you need to mitigate and what you have to be willing to live with and tolerate. And when you think about it, that is the decision we all have to make all the time about everything in our lives. Whether we take out formal insurance policies or we sort of hedge our bets with pseudo insurance policies, we are always thinking about the risks that we're taking and the ways that we can mitigate those. And what has become very important to me as I look at the world around us is how much harder it feels like it is becoming to mitigate risk. The world is an inherently risky place. It always has been. And there have been catastrophic events that have happened throughout the history of mankind. But we've only really had the modern form of economics based on the rights of individuals to own property, for example, and to own businesses. We've only had that for, let's just call it roughly the last 300 years or so, in one form or another, in a formal way that we would recognize today. We'll call it the corporate structure. And the rights of an individual to own their own home, to own their own land, to make their own way in the world. A very modern take on human development. This is relatively new in human history. And while there have been many calamities over that period of time, it doesn't seem like those were any more difficult to mitigate than they had ever been in generations prior. I feel like there's a changing tide. And I say this because we first started hearing about challenges in the insurance markets from the United States when it came to the topic of flood insurance. And this became a big issue here in the United States after Hurricane Katrina made landfall in New Orleans, near New Orleans, made landfall in Mississippi, I believe. But the city of New Orleans and the entirety of the Gulf Coast was seriously impacted by that storm, and the losses and the damage was catastrophic. And of course, the insurance losses were catastrophic. And it became apparent that there were some communities that really, by all rights, should not have been insurable. The the amount of danger that those communities were in inherently by being where they were in extraordinarily flood prone areas of both the cities and the coastline made it almost a guarantee that at some point there'd be major flooding. And in some cases, especially in a city like New Orleans that resides below sea level, it was pretty much a guarantee that it was going to happen. And this began a bigger conversation about flood insurance, which is hard to acquire in the US, and there's very little, if any, private market for it. The federal government generally backs that. But the debate was, should the government, paid for by the taxpayers, be backing inherently risky behavior, building in floodplains, for example, building below sea level, building in places where it's almost a guarantee someday that your community will be wiped out and flooded out. And it was a beginning of a discussion that turned out to be pretty prescient because we have continued to see extreme weather events all over the world, but I'll talk specifically about what's happened in the United States, become fairly routine. And the problem is that insurance, the nature of insurance, is that it insures you against what we would normally consider to be extreme, rare, highly unusual, but very expensive events. And so you buy an insurance policy hoping and expecting that you may never actually have to make a claim against it, because insurance, by its definition, is only there to insure against a worst case scenario. But what happens in an environment and a world where the worst case scenarios of these mega, extremely expensive, and extremely destructive events suddenly become more frequent? Now the calculation changes about what insurance really is and what it can cover and what it can afford to cover. So remember, one of the reasons that there's not much of a private market in the United States, or really in most places in the world, for flood insurance is because there are certain places in the world where flooding is absolutely inevitable. There are many people around the world that live in natural floodplains. There are others who live close to rivers and creeks and lakes that have a long history of busting their banks. There are many people who live downstream from dams or from other water retention systems, from a levee system that is susceptible to wear and tear and breaking down and erosion. In other words, there's a lot of people who are susceptible to this, and unfortunately, it tends to be that flooding is an extraordinarily expensive insurance claim to pay out because of how much damage is done, and homes become a total loss very, very quickly. So that is what has happened to the flood insurance market. It's a very hard thing to acquire. It's a very expensive thing to acquire if you do it through the private market. And many people have to acquire this through a mechanism with the government, with a debate about whether the government should back it or not. But that was the extreme. But now we're starting to see this in all forms of insurance. So think about homeowners insurance. Anybody who owns a home anywhere in the United States will understand that rates have shot up. It is very expensive now. Depending on where you are in the country, there are some places that are now uninsurable. There are no private insurance providers willing to write policies in parts of California because of their recent history of wildfires. They are not willing to write insurance policies in portions of Florida, and some insurance companies have completely pulled out of the state of Florida, at least from writing any new policies, because of the frequency of hurricanes and destructive storms, and now increasingly even sunny day flooding in some of the coastal communities. And we're also seeing in the rest of the country where there are insurance providers who are willing to provide insurance, the rates are going up. We've seen plenty of stories in states like Texas, Georgia, the Carolinas, the Northeast, the Midwest, any place that's been susceptible to flooding, hailstorms, tornadoes, or just big damaging weather events like we've seen all over the country in recent weeks, months, and years. We're seeing homeowners insurance rates spike anywhere from 10 or 15% on a conservative basis to as much as 40 or 50% or more. This insurance is becoming increasingly unaffordable, even for those who have homes they could easily afford and they have mortgages that they can afford. All of a sudden, if your homeowner's insurance becomes 40, 50, 60, 70% more expensive than it was the day you closed on your house, now the cost of keeping that house for some families starts to get very challenging. And when we think about other forms of insurance, anybody who has a car, if you have auto insurance, you know what those rates have looked like. Anywhere from 8 to 15% increases are now pretty routine across the country, and there's plenty of outliers that are much higher than that. Bankrate.com indicated that the average auto insurance policy now is about $2,000 a year minimum, and many are even higher than that for newer model vehicles, sport utility vehicles, trucks, those that are just simply more expensive if you have to replace them. The average family is seeing anywhere from $150 to $250 per year increases on their auto insurance. That's a big deal for a lot of families. And we're just talking about homeowners and auto. We all know the issues in the United States, at least, with health insurance. But even if you live in other countries, consider your federal government or your state government or whatever, consider your government plan a form of insurance. Whether you're in the US and you're dealing with private insurance or insurance through your employer, or if you're anywhere in the world and you get your insurance and your health care through the government, make no mistake, the costs are rising rapidly. Now, here in the United States, many of those costs get passed directly on to consumers and into the businesses that fund these policies. But if you go anywhere else in the world, the government is absorbing these costs increasingly and having to pass them on in the form of either new taxes or new borrowing that also results eventually in more spending. The cost of all of these things is rising rapidly. And I'm specifically talking about the insurance element. My concern as I look over the next several months, the next several years, and something I have asked a couple of guests on my program in various ways, what happens if large sections of the world become uninsurable? Remember that insurance enables so much of the economic activity and risk taking that defines the modern economic system. Even business insurance. It allows an individual to buy a $40,000 vehicle in the US or a $10,000 vehicle anywhere in the world, or whatever your local currency is. And it allows you to drive it with confidence, knowing that if you get into an accident, if somebody hits you or you accidentally hit somebody, that you're not going to go broke. That there's an insurance policy that you pay into along with a lot of other people, and that accident is a hopefully once in a lifetime, maybe twice in a lifetime event, or you have a small ding or a small piece of damage or something happens to your car or it gets in a hailstorm or something, and it's going to be able to be repaired. What happens in a world where that insurance becomes prohibitively expensive for large numbers of people? What happens in a world where large numbers of auto insurers simply pull out of the market because they can't figure out a formula to stay afloat? What happens in a world where homeowners insurance becomes unreceivable, where there's no one in the market to provide the policies any longer, and where those who are there to provide policies write such prohibitively expensive policies that the vast majority of even qualified home buyers who have no issue affording the principal and interest and basic property taxes can't afford the kind of rising insurance costs to mitigate the risk of owning their own home. And health insurance, we already know in the United States and any other market where people had to go for their own health insurance, how expensive those policies are, and therefore how many people went without until the government intervened and started providing subsidies for people to afford any form of health insurance. But again, those subsidies are still being paid for out of the overall economic picture of a country. So, all this having been said, I think it's a serious concern for our policymakers, for our business leaders, for our insurance executives for that matter. Because as climate change continues to play a role in our world, regardless of what role you think that is or what the causes are, there's little question that we are seeing more extreme weather events, and they're likely tied to an overall changing in our global climate. And if that's the case, and we're going to expect more and more extreme events, it's going to be harder and harder for insurance to provide insurance against those extreme events at any affordable cost. And I want to bring this issue down to a personal level. When I was a young kid, my family went without insurance for significant periods of my youth. Not because we didn't want to, not because we didn't think it was a good idea, but because our family really couldn't afford it in the light of all of the other bills that my parents had to deal with on a single working class salary for the bulk of that time when I was a kid. We knew it was dangerous, but what we had to do was mitigate significantly our activities to mitigate our own risks. So, for example, I did not play organized sports because in order to play organized sports, you needed to be insured. Of course, why wouldn't you be? If you play organized sports as a kid, there's a good chance you're going to injure a toe or a thumb or an ankle or a knee or something, and it's important that you have an ability to have insurance to pay for that injury. Well, what happens if the insurance is so expensive that you can't afford it or it's not offered? In my case, it was an affordability issue, but there weren't very many people who offered individual policies in the United States back then. So what ended up happening was that people like myself just couldn't take as many risks, couldn't play those organized sports, had to be careful even in things like gym class. Now, you may think, well, that's not much of a sacrifice, right? You still got to run around like a kid. You still did other things. You just couldn't necessarily go and participate as fully as you may have otherwise wanted to. And I wasn't the most athletic kid in the universe, so it wasn't like, the world missed out on the next Michael Jordan. But the point is, the lack of insurance changed my family's behavior. It changed my behavior. If we start seeing large sections of our economy uninsurable or unaffordable for insurance to be provided, how many families are going to have to start taking big personal risk mitigation steps that are not going to be good for the economy? You may think this is laughable, but think about it for a working class family that can't afford two auto insurance policies, but they could afford two cars in any other circumstance, under any other situation. But if they can't afford the second policy, that becomes a one-car household, and that can have very significant impacts on that family for their economic viability of getting to work. Or, worst case scenario, they take a humongous risk. They choose to go uninsured, and goodness forbid if they get into any sort of vehicle accident and either they're out all that money for the car or there's a liability because they caused the accident and now it's going to come all back on them. The point is, it is a huge impact. And we're just talking about one family. Now multiply that by all the working class families that have to make a decision like that, and you've got a big problem. Let's talk about homeowners insurance for a moment. What happens to cities and towns across America if all of a sudden significant portions of those towns literally cannot get a private insurance company to write a policy, or you have policies available, but homeowners literally cannot afford to pay the premium, or the policy is so junk to make it affordable that people take on 10, 15, $20,000 deductibles so that the next time a storm comes through, their entire budget for the next 2 years is wrecked because they have to repair a roof or blown out windows or siding or who knows what will happen during the course of a given storm. This has major implications for our economy if large numbers of working class families, even middle class families, all of a sudden can't afford basic insurance. And now the normal risks that we all take, they're either going to mitigate their own risk in a way that takes them out of the economy in a significant way, or certainly pulls money out of the economy, or they go and take humongous risks by going uninsured, at least on their vehicles where they can, or they forego home buying altogether. This becomes a big, big problem. And we know this because before the healthcare laws that exist in America today, we know millions upon millions of people went uninsured. Even today, with more widely available insurance policies subsidized by the federal and state governments, people still go without insurance because they can't afford it, not because they don't want to. And we know what they do as a result. When they didn't have health insurance, they avoided going to the doctor. That was their risk mitigation. Since they didn't have an insurance policy to fall back on, they just didn't go, and they allowed little issues to become big issues. And we also know that when you have no insurance, medical options become far more limited for you. And again, that can have a direct impact on your personal economic and societal liability and viability. The point of this entire conversation is to simply raise to consciousness for all of you that I think this is a very important topic that nobody is talking about. And I think we're probably years away from the peak of this. But almost every week over the last year, I have had somebody in my social circle talk about this issue of rising insurance rates and how it's getting pretty expensive for those who have a little bit of money. But for those who are really just getting by paycheck to paycheck, this is really starting to force some difficult decisions. And those are economic in nature for those individuals. But if you widen out to the societal scale, these are much bigger concerns. And the more that insurance premiums rise to deal with the increasing risks of our world, the more money that pulls out of working families' pockets into their insurance premium just to mitigate the risk of living and driving. And the less money they're going to have to spend on everything else that they do. And the bigger risks they're probably going to be willing to take that could cost them even worse down the road. I don't have a policy prescription for this, and this is where I am looking forward to hopefully talking to guests in the weeks and months to come about some of this theory, about whether I am justifiably concerned or not, and what some proposals might be to deal with it. But I can tell you that it seems and feels like it's a very real issue for a great many families as it is today, but it's about to be a big issue for many, many more who haven't really thought about it up until this point. And if we do see any kind of economic slowdown in the United States or around the world, it's going to be felt more and more acutely over time. And the issue of risk mitigation through insurance is central to the modern economy of our Western world, certainly, but throughout much of the international community. I think that it is always dangerous to then simply say, we'll put this in the hands of bureaucrats or government or state officials. But there's probably going to have to be some kind of public policy incentive for insurance companies to stay in this market. Someone's going to have to try to mitigate the risk. But we as a society are probably going to have a much bigger conversation because that's a superficial item. Who helps cover this growing risk? And there's always going to be an incentive for public officials to try to come in and prop up that market. But much like the flood insurance issue after Hurricane Katrina struck the New Orleans and Mississippi coastlines, the federal government had to decide if it was going to stay in the business of flood insurance. And we also saw private insurance companies have to make some really tough choices. I think we as a nation, we as a world are going to have to start coming to terms with the world we live in. It is a more extreme planet, and there's more of us than there were before. We live in more places that are more exposed to extreme heat and extreme cold, to extreme winds, to extreme rains. We're going to see more floods. We're going to see more tornadoes. They're going to be larger, more violent, and there's just more of us. So we're in more places and therefore more exposed to more of these events. And if all the projections about our changing planet come to pass, there are coastal communities that will be unlivable in decades to come because of rising sea levels. There will be other communities that are unlivable because of heat issues. There are others who will be unlivable because of constant flooding issues. There are going to be some really tough choices that may have to be made about what is and isn't insurable any longer. And if the risk gets too great to do certain activities that we take for granted, how does that reshape a society? What if we get to a point where we're no longer talking about home affordability based on price and interest rates, but your ability to pay the homeowner's insurance premium? What if we start getting into an environment where you can afford your car payment, but you can't afford your car insurance payment? And what happens when we get into an environment where all forms of insurance are unaffordable and we're unable to properly mitigate risks from health, environment, vehicles, natural disasters, and we're all just more exposed to the extreme costs that come with these extreme events? I don't believe our modern economic system has really absorbed what that would mean to our current economic model. It's a topic that I look forward to exploring more. It's a topic that I would love to hear from all of you on. My email address is info at brianjmatos.com. You can find me on any of your favorite social media platforms, including X, formerly known as Twitter. I'm at Brian J. Matos on that platform. You can find me on Facebook. I hope you will follow my fan page there. You can find me on Instagram, Brian J. Matos. You can find me on YouTube. Subscribe to that channel at Brian J. Matos Podcast, or just search Brian J. Matos. You can always visit my website, brianjmatos.com. This episode is posted there along with a few show notes. And every one of my episodes has a few of my thoughts in the show notes. And of course, I ask you once again to subscribe anywhere you get your podcasts: Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Odyssey. You can find me on your Amazon Music. You can find me on the Audible app there. And really anywhere that you get your podcasts. And please share this episode. If you know others who are interested in some of the topics that we've covered here today, I encourage you to share those episodes with your family and your friends. And come back and listen to the program again. Next week, we have Carrie Ann Benton Stimson. She is a chief marketing officer, but so much more. She joined us from Kingston, Jamaica, talking about internal marketing, employee advocacy, her career trajectory, an inspiring woman, and I hope you will tune in next week to listen to that program. In the meantime, as always, thank you for spending some time with me. Hopefully, for those who were asking to hear more from me, this episode will assuage you, and you'll be hearing from me more in the coming weeks, since I know this is something that you all want to hear more of, some of my thoughts and topics on the issues of the world around us. So I'll make sure to continue doing that, and I'll bring on more and more guests so that we can explore these topics in greater detail with the true experts and continue to expand our community of curious minds. And so until next time, I invite you all to stay curious.